My name is Walt Sigdermans. I will be discussing Where Napoleon Imprisoned Polperro's Privateers. My connection to Polperro is through my great-grandmother, Anne Elizabeth Hackshaw, who was a major influence on me. She was born in Grimsby in 1883 and immigrated to Canada in 1905. Her first husband, Louis Curtis, was born in Polperro in 1877 and died in the Great War. While researching Louis Curtis in 1999, I contacted the Polperro historian, Jeremy Johns, and he introduced me to the family history research of Frank Paracosta. From Frank's pedigree charts, I learned that Louis Curtis's great-great-grandfather, John Paschio, was a privateer, was captured by the French, and spent 20 years in prison. In 2019, while my wife and I were planning a trip to Polperro, I contacted Jeremy Johns once again. He encouraged me to join the Polperro Family Historical Society, which I did, and I dutifully read the entire archive of back issues of their journals. I was most impressed by a 3-page article published in the 3rd issue of the journal written by James Derryman. It turns out that my ancestor, John Paschio, wasn't imprisoned by the French for 20 years, as Frank Paracosta had surmised, but using records unavailable to Mr. Paracosta, Mr. Derryman placed the time of imprisonment at something closer to 6 or 7 years. From his article, I learned that the ship that my privateering 5X great-grandfather had served on was called Resolution. It was granted a letter of marque in December of 1807. The ship had 3 masts, 8 3-pound guns, and a crew of 30. According to an article in the April 21, 1808 Derby Mercury, the Resolution was attacked and burned by 2 French frigates, Hortense and Hermione. According to French records, the surviving crew of the Resolution were captured on March 20, 1808, landed at Brest, and then marched over the course of 2.5 months to Depot de Biche, arriving there on June 14, 1808. According to Derryman's research, of the 16 Polperro men sent to Biche, 1 died shortly after they arrived at the prison. The crewmen of the Resolution were imprisoned in Biche for 1 year before they were all transferred to Sarre-Louis. According to a Falmouth Packet article written on November 1812, 13 of the Polperro crewmen of Resolution were still imprisoned in Depot Sarre-Louis 3 years after they were released from Biche. It was when I looked up Biche and Sarre-Louis on Google Maps that I decided that I wanted to visit these places, which I did in 2024. There are a number of authors who had also been imprisoned by the French during the Napoleonic Wars, and I will be referencing their work. Alexander Stewart was a young lad of 14 when he was imprisoned in Sarre-Louis in 1806. He was at Sarre-Louis when the Polperro men arrived there. Alexander Stewart eventually tried to escape Sarre-Louis in 1811, was captured and sent to Biche, where, because he had learned French while in Sarre-Louis, became a translator for one of the officers at Biche and was allowed to live topside and not in the cellars. Richard Langton was imprisoned in Biche from 1811 until 1813, and he not only wrote about his experiences, he also illustrated his book. I will be referencing his drawings as well as his writings. Maurice Hewson was imprisoned in Biche and successfully escaped shortly after the Polperro crewmen of Resolution arrived at Biche. Hewson's manuscript was published with the permission of his great-granddaughter in 1981. Seacombe Ellison was imprisoned in Verdun, sent to Biche, and subsequently attempted escape from Biche multiple times. George Richard Cassay was imprisoned in Arras, attempted escape, was captured, and he was sent to Biche shortly after the Polperro men had been transferred from Biche to Sarre-Louis. After 1 year, he was sent to Sarre-Louis while the Polperro crewmen were there. He has relevant descriptions of Biche and Sarre-Louis. Alexander Stewart had the most descriptive account of his capture and initial march to the depot. Alexander Stewart on marching between depots. We were marched off to Dunkirk, each carrying the few clothes that he was allowed to bring with him from the ship, slung on his back. We were tied to each other with a strong cord, much as you may see a number of horses coming to Smithfield, and escorted by a party of soldiers, headed by two drummers, beating what I suppose we should call the Rogue's March, to give dignity to the scene. We arrived in Dunkirk towards evening, on entering which our guard, to our great annoyance, again beat their drums at our head to summon the idle, the curious, and the simple, to witness French trophies of war. We were soon landed in the town prison. In a few days after this, we started our march to the interior of the country. We marched generally about 25 miles a day, lodging in jail every night with such French criminals as might be there. We had each, during this march, 1.5 pounds of coarse brown bread, and 3 halfpence in money, with which we purchased onions, apples, etc., to eat with our bread. After the 4th day, our guard allowed us to march without being tied together, nor had we any longer a drummer at our head. There are several images of Biche as it appeared during the Napoleonic era. Some of these drawings were made by English prisoners as they attempted to explain the dichotomy of their situation. This depot was, for the Napoleonic Wars, what Colditz was during the Second World War. It was the prison where all the problem prisoners were sent for punishment. It housed all the repeat escapees and uncooperative prisoners. All the bad eggs were placed in this one beautifully picturesque basket. The fortress was set atop a natural stone prominence, located in the middle of a wooded valley. It had been used as a fort for centuries. During the reign of Louis XIV, a heavily fortified citadel with steep walls and multiple layers of defenses was constructed on this hill. During the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, Fortress Biche was under siege and artillery bombardment, and since that time, the large 3-story buildings atop the fortress are gone. The tallest building remaining standing is the chapel. However, the approaches to the fortress and the cellars where much of the story takes place are still intact. Richard Cassé on first seeing Biche. On the 3rd day after leaving Sarre-Louis, we arrived in view of the long-sought fortress of Biche. We had just emerged from a deep valley when its fortifications appeared full in view, being then about the distance of 2 leagues. In the heart of the curious and intelligent traveler, it could not have failed to excite feelings of a highly imaginative and romantic character, and assuredly deserves a more glowing description of its beauties than can possibly flow from my pen, especially if it be remembered, however grand and imposing its appearance might be in reality, that we were to be confined within its gloomy and adamantine walls, excluded from the possibility or even hope of ever escaping. Richard Langton on seeing Biche. Of all the fortifications in France, there is none whose situation and formation appears so extraordinary as the fort of which I am about to give a faithful, and I trust not uninteresting, description. When seen from the Metz road, it is scarcely possible to conceive that a confinement here could be so terrible as that which I am about to report. Alexander Stewart, description of Biche. It is a strong fort built on a rock, small in size and connected with a town or village of the same name. The ascent from the town winds very much. The gates were very large and the drawbridges very lofty, shot and cannon in great abundance. After passing through several gates and squares abundantly supplied with sentinels, we came to the top, where we saw numbers of prisoners walking backwards and forwards on the ground between the parapet wall and the soldiers' barracks. Under these barracks there were immense souterrains, about 25 feet deep, cut out of the rock, whose sides continually oozed out water. These were our lodgings. Here we were shut up every night and 3 hours in the middle of the day. This midday confinement was part of the punishment. The place was always damp, very badly lighted, and extremely uncomfortable. There were about 250 of us in this place. This was a place of punishment, not only for deserters, but for other offenders against the constituted authorities. Here were some of the most distinguished prisoners in France, but there were many of a very opposite kind, base fellows who had been sent there for thieving and such like. Officers soon obtained leave to live in the barrack rooms over the souterrains, and consequently mingled little with the prisoners. The last gate that you go through to enter the fort is a long tunnel, about 100 meters long. Near the front of that tunnel, there is a doorway on the left where the horses would be led to the underground stables. There's a commanding view of the entire valley from the top of the castle. There was once a 3-story tall barracks in the center of the castle. This was used to house high-value English officers. You can still see the foundations of the old barracks. The foundation of that barracks was the roof of the largest chamber where many of the prisoners were kept. If you look closely, you can see that there are small windows along the bottom edges of those foundations. Those windows, about 25 feet above the floor of the cellar, was the source of light and fresh air for the prisoners below. Sometimes that air was too fresh, particularly in the winter. Langton wrote of how the snow would blow down through those windows and down onto the prisoners' cots in the cellar below. According to a number of authors, the prisoners were allowed to walk in the spaces between the upper barracks and the castle parapet. The accounts differ as to how long this exercise was allowed. There is a maze of chambers that run inside the length of the fortress. Besides the stable, there was also an underground blacksmith shop. The fortress also had its own water supply in the form of an 80-meter deep well, which was serviced by a 2-man treadmill. Originally, there was a 3-story tall bakery. The upper stories of the bakery were destroyed during the 1870 siege. However, the bakery's oven was in the cellar, so it avoided destruction and still exists. A number of authors bemoaned the coarse brown bread that was baked for the prisoners. One constant description of the cellars by all of the authors was that it was cold, wet, and dark in the cellars. Richard Cassay wrote of men standing in the fireplaces at night so they could continue playing cards after lights out. The sooty walls of the fireplace absorbed the sound of their conversation and concealed the light of their candles. But most of all, the cellars were crowded and violent. Seacombe Ellison on the fights within Biche. The standing order was that all lights should be put out at 8 o'clock. But when there was any new arrival, any rejoicing night, or any snick, a cheap liquor distilled from potatoes, the order became a dead letter. When it was first issued, the gendarmes would venture down to put them out, but often as they entered the souterrain, away hats and shoes thrown at their lantern, and when that was demolished, anything that could be laid hold of flew after them, which caused a hasty retreat. They met with no other reception, if ever they went down to suppress the rows. The guards were horrified at the regular stand-up fights and were anxious to separate the combatants, fearing they might kill each other. At length the gendarmes had such a dread of going amongst them that they had to be accompanied by the veterans, and the commandant, finding the inutility of interfering, told his men to leave them to themselves, and, if they chose to kill one another, they were at liberty to do so. For his part, he would listen to no complaints, nor give the injured redress, and that henceforward they governed themselves. They took him at his word, and when thefts were committed, or any crime that was thought worthy of public inquiry, a court-martial was held, and the accused brought before his accuser. When, if found guilty, he was sentenced to so many stripes, which were immediately inflicted. Here were seamen flogging their own comrades, and for what reason? Because they could devise no other punishment equally effective to keep each other's vices in some sort of check. After the punishment had been administered, the cat was given back to the custody of the brigadier of the fort. Richard Cassay on fights within Biche. This depot, like the rest, was a scene of licentiousness and vice, and I think might be drawn in a deeper shade than most others. This will easily be accounted for when it is understood that the majority of the prisoners were not sent here for honorably endeavoring to obtain their liberty. What made this place extremely uncomfortable was, the impossibility of retreating from any of the brawls that so frequently occurred, and the very great difficulty of escaping unhurt amidst the furious battles and drunken riots. Few days passed without some fracas, but on the first of every month, which was the time the officers were paid, nothing could exceed the disorder that then generally prevailed. Richard Langton on the fights in Biche. A strong spirit denominated snick, extracted, as it was said, from potatoes, and generally used by the inhabitants, was exceedingly cheap, a tumbler glass costing but 2 sous. Owing to this, particularly on pay days, scenes occurred of which it would be in vain to give an adequate description. Sleep for nights together could not be obtained. When a sailor arrived at Biche, if he had the appearance of a boxer, his prowess was soon tried. There were several scientific pugilists amongst them, and fights of the most determined character frequently took place in the souterrains. The larger chamber usually contained 140 to 160 men, and the smaller 80 to 100 men. There were likewise a few confined in the vaulted cellar, which the prisoners denominated St. Giles. Under the eastern end of Citadel de Biche, there are a series of tunnels and solitary confinement cells, which the English prisoners referred to as St. Giles. Apparently, all prisoners were initially confined here on arrival, or if some prisoner misbehaved, he might be sent down for solitary confinement. This part of the castle is not in very good condition. It has no water, heating, or electricity. I was able to get a guided tour with one of the museum staff. He held a torch and I my cell phone with this flashlight app. After the Franco-Prussian War, the town and fortress of Biche were occupied by the Germans. Under German management, the walls in these tunnels were scored, plastered, and whitewashed. In 2007, some plaster had flaked off, revealing graffiti made by English prisoners during Napoleonic times. The graffiti had been damaged when the walls were scored to ensure that the plaster would stick to the walls, but some are still legible. Who knows what other graffiti might still be hidden under the remaining plaster? At the bottom of the hill, in the town beneath Citadel de Biche, stands what used to be the infirmary. The old hospital building is now a library and media center, but the building is virtually unchanged. There is much graffiti carved into the red sandstone all about the courtyard, some dating to the Napoleonic era, but I saw no sign of any Resolution crew. Richard Langton on the infirmary at Biche. The dampness of the place in which I had to rest brought on that very general complaint here, ague, and a great many of my companions were, at this period, suffering severely from it. The medical attendant of the fort deemed a removal to the hospital of the town necessary. I repaired there without regret, for it was a change, though not accompanied with any more liberty than in the courtyard. The English were here placed in a long room in the lower floor of the hospital, to a number of about 60. In one of a similar description on the other side of the yard, there were several Spanish officers, like ourselves prisoners of war, who had been removed from a fortress near the Rhine. With them we were allowed no communication. When awaking in the morning, I invariably inquired how my roommate had passed the night, and on my doing so that morning, his head being turned from me, and receiving no answer, on taking a more careful look, I perceived that he was dead. His death occurred unknown to the attendants of the ward during the night. I perfectly remember, on the sailors coming to look at the corpse of their shipmate, one said, "Poor Bill, he don't need mind gendarmes now." After 1 year in Biche, the surviving crewmen of the Resolution were moved to Sarre-Louis. This depot, north of Biche, was built in 1680 along the shore of the river Sarre during the reign of Louis XIV. Water from the Sarre River was diverted to supply the moat that ran around the city walls, and the walls were shaped much like a stylized sun, typical of construction of the time, but also a reference to the Sun King who had initiated its construction. Hence, it was named Sarre-Louis. After the French Revolution, the city was renamed Sarre-Libre. The English prisoners were imprisoned within the walls of the old fortress, which was in turn surrounded by a moat, with French guards posted both inside and outside the walls. After the Napoleonic War, the city was renamed back to Sarre-Louis, and the city was ceded back to the adjacent German state. Most of the old city walls and moat have long since been broken down and filled in. The Sarre River has also since been diverted from its original 17th century path. There is still a small section of the original walls along the old Sarre River. However, the site of the old French fortress and the French POW depot were both located in what is now the old German Altstadt of Sarre-Louis. Richard Cassé on arriving at Sarre-Louis. The morning proved wet, and the gendarmes ornamented us again with our iron ruffles. But being in good health and spirits, we accomplished our day's journey without much difficulty. On the fourth day from leaving the fortress of Biche, and after attending at the commandant's office, we were appointed to our respective room in the barrack. The small town or fortress is situated on a branch of the Sarre, in the department of Moselle in the province of Lorraine. The town, which, from its limited situation, is not very populous, is built so as to form a quadrangle with a spacious open square in the center, where is the market and which is sometimes used as military parade ground. The houses are neat, and there is tolerably good church, which is used both by the Catholics and the Protestants. Behind the town buildings and next to the ramparts are immense stone barracks and magazines capable of containing many thousands of men and horse. In one of the largest rows of these barracks on the south side of the town, about 3,000 of my fellow countrymen were confined. Much of the original fortress has been destroyed and replaced with houses and roads. However, at the north end of the town, there are still some of the original fortress walls adjacent to a city park. The curator of the museum in Sarre-Louis told me that one of the original three-story barracks buildings dating from the time of the Napoleonic War, located along the wall, still exists today. I felt compelled to go see it and photograph it. Alexander Stewart on Sarre-Louis Barracks. In Sarre-Libre, as generally in all fortified towns, there are long lines of barracks running parallel with the inside of the rampart elevations, on whose top the guns are worked in times of siege. One of these barracks was fitted up for us. There were 10 corridors, 5 on each side, of a large gateway which led to the town. In each corridor there were 6 rooms, that is, including the stables whose tacks were removed for our accommodation. Each of these rooms contained 7 bedsteads with straw mattresses and a blanket, as in a hospital prison. We were thus 14 in each room. The entrance door of the corridor was locked every night. We had the range of the 6 rooms except on special occasions for punishment when the rooms were severally locked. This was a very superior position to our previous boarding, for here we could breathe freely even when locked up, while the range of the top of the ramparts during the day was to us as life from the dead. Our allowance of bread, meat, beans was the same here as in the former place, with at least an equal amount of deductions for pretended depredations, and quite as many heads and shanks supplied with the meat. Yet even in regard to food, we found ourselves greatly improved. Now each room constituted a distinct mess and had a separate fire, kettle, and platter. Each room had a tub for its own water, which we replenished every morning at the common pump, locked up at all other times. The corridor had a large tub which stood under the stairs for special purposes that need not be named, and which 2 of us in turn emptied every morning. The French provided bread and 3 sous a day for prisoners to purchase food, meat, and vegetables. Anything else they needed, shoes, pants, alcohol, A sou was equal to 5 centimes, so they were allowed 15 centimes per day. Shortly after the war started, the English government began paying Royal Navy prisoners of war. However, this left the merchant marine and privateers at the bottom of the prison economy. According to Alexander Stewart, merchant sailors could earn money by cooking, cleaning the mess area, or emptying chamber pots. To alleviate this income discrepancy, in 1812 several fundraising drives collected money for Cornish POWs. This may have been a lifesaver for surviving crew of the Resolution who, according to newspaper accounts, were still imprisoned in Saarlouis in November 1812. This cash allowed them not only to fill their bellies, but also to purchase new shoes and warm clothing. The curator of the museum in Saarlouis showed me a publication, in German, which said that between October and November 1813, the British prisoners of war were removed from Saarlouis and French soldiers were then housed in the fortress. The British prisoners were distributed between Bapaume and Beauchamp. This was confirmed by an 1814 newspaper article. It seems that the coalition forces were closing in on France. Napoleon was forced to reshuffle his forces. Fortresses which were previously backwaters were now strategic locations which needed to be defended. Saarlouis was just such a vital crossroad. George Cassé was at Saarlouis at the same time as the Resolution crewmen, so his account of the removal from the fortress is relevant and perhaps similar to that of the Polperro men. Richard Cassé on leaving Saarlouis. In October 1813, we left Saarlouis in a company or draft of about 500 men guarded by 20 or 30 veterans, and took the direction of Cambrai. We halted on the road at an old convent where we were to rest for the night, having made a short day's journey of 5 leagues. The next morning we again proceeded forward, and at the end of the second day's stage we were billeted in the inhabitants of several contiguous villages. Next morning we found our guards had left us, with only one gendarme to direct us on our journey, which led us to consider ourselves free of any restraint. From motives best known to those who directed us, we were kept as much as possible from entering into large towns, but were directed mostly through country roads and bypaths, and took up our lodging in villages. Whenever we arrived at a village or small town at the end of our day's journey, we always inquired after and presented ourselves before Monsieur le Maire, who, when found, delivered us billets on the peasantry, the circum-adjacent villages and hamlets. At every large town where we stopped, an old church, convent, or stable was provided for our reception. In consequence of the wet weather and miserable state of the roads, our number had greatly decreased by the time we reached Sedan. Many, not being able to bear the fatigue of walking at this inclement season of the year, had been conducted to hospitals. It was pitiable to see many poor fellows who had not been quite so provident as others, without any shoes, laboring over flinty roads, and very frequently many miles through fields of sharp stubble, with their naked feet half perished with cold and covered with blood. I found it quite as much as I could possibly bear, though well in health and tolerably well clothed. Very frequently it would rain heavily all the day's journey, and the deep miry country roads would for several miles resemble a canal, which obligated us to walk to our knees in mud and water, so that at the end of our journey not a dry thread remained on us, being completely drenched in mire. About the middle of November we arrived at Cambrai, our number being reduced to less than half. France, during that first conclusion of the Napoleonic Wars, was a chaotic hot mess. We don't know where the crew of the Resolution were ultimately held when the war ended, but it was a much easier journey to Calais from Bapaume or Bucharest than it would have been from Saarlouis. Of the 12 Polperro sailors who were alive in Saarlouis in 1812, we don't know who made it back to England in 1814 or how they did it. Still, it's amazing to see how much we can puzzle together of the experiences of a baker's dozen of Polperro sailors over 2 centuries later.